Welcome back to the BTR Boxing Podcast Network. I'm your host, Sean. This week, joined by Hamed for a preview of the action coming this weekend. We've got the Ring 4 card in Saudi Arabia. We've got David Benavidez, Anthony Yarde, Brian Norman Jr. versus Devin Haney, Jesse Bam Rodriguez versus Fernando Martinez, and Sam Noakes versus Abdullah Mason as the 4 big fights on this particular card. Hamed, welcome as always. We've got an interesting card this weekend. Obviously, there are some other fights on the undercard, which I probably won't go too much into in this episode, ladies and gentlemen. I'm focusing primarily on those 4 big fights that I think are going to be interesting for people to be tuning into this weekend.
Hello, Sean. Excuse me. Thanks for having me back on. It's a pleasure to be back on because I think this is probably, if I was to say, the second best or maybe arguably the best card of the year alongside that February card. And it'll be good to talk to you about these fights, and it'll be interesting to get your thoughts on some of the fights on this upcoming card.
Okay, well, we're going to start then, Hamed. We'll go into the fights. We'll talk about David Benavidez and Anthony Yarde being the first one that I'd like to sort of bring to the table with yourself, Hamed. And I think David Benavidez obviously is a fighter which people have been looking at for years and really warming to and really wanting him to see him against Canelo. That obviously hasn't happened. He's moved up to light heavyweight. He's been dominant so far. He has had a couple of fights where he hasn't looked fantastic and people have then sort of shot him down. Now he's in this fight, of course, with Anthony Yarde, who a British fighter who we know very well, who has obviously had his opportunities at the top level and has fell at the final hurdle at the top level. Of course, fighting Sergey Kovalev a few years back and then Artur Beterbiev in a real slug 'em tough out affair. But Anthony Yarde just hasn't had that moment in his career, and he hasn't really had that big fight experience moment where he's been able to overcome adversity. Can you see this being any different for Anthony Yarde going in against David Benavidez, Hamed?
Based on Benavidez's last couple of fights or his career, you'd have to favor Benavidez. The only problem is, since David Benavidez has moved up, he hasn't really come close to stopping either of his opponents, which was Alexander Gvozdyk last year and then David Morrell earlier this year. At the same time, Anthony Yarde has a tendency to get dragged into, like you said, slugfest against Sergey Kovalev. He ended up hurting Kovalev, but then he ended up getting gassed out and essentially stopped. And although I thought he did better against Artur Beterbiev than Callum Smith and some other maybe fighters you could say recently, apart from the Bivol fights, he ended up still getting drawn into a toe-to-toe fight, and he ended up getting stopped. Is David Benavidez as a bigger puncher as those guys like Kovalev or Beterbiev? I'd probably say no. But at the same time, he is younger. I believe that both of them. And he's more or less in his physical prime. So you'd have to favor Benavidez. Can he stop him? I mean, anything is possible. For a guy like Yarde who ends up getting fatigued or ends up gassing out in a lot of fights when it's these type of fights. So it is possible, but I would give Yarde like a chance of if he could hurt Benavidez, because I think he has got a legitimate puncher's chance, and I would say he's a live dog because Benavidez also has a tendency to get clipped or even get a bit lazy at times. He got dropped by David Morrell late on, and I know a lot of people would argue that may not have been a legitimate knockdown because the knees clash, but he did get caught as well whilst he went down. He got caught by Ronald Gavril. I thought he got hit a lot more than I thought he would against Gvozdyk. So if Yarde could crack and show he is what he was at times in some of these fights, even lost or was once perceived to be, then Yarde does have a chance. But I would say Benavidez is at least a 60 or 70, 60-40 or a 70-30 favorite on paper. That's how I would put it.
I think maybe Anthony Yarde's tendency to bring fighters into that type of a fight where they're sort of throwing their boxing abilities and skills out of the window and slugging it out on the inside might actually be something that works in his favour this time round. He's tried it with Beterbiev. He couldn't match Beterbiev. He's done it in the past against Sergey Kovalev. He couldn't match it. He didn't have the stamina and he didn't have the experience at that point, I don't believe. Could he do something different here? Could he bring Benavidez down to that level where he forces him to fight on the inside, and it will be a test of mental fortitude between the two of them. You rightly pointed out then, Hamed, about Benavidez being dropped against Morel, being hurt against Gavril. He has a tendency to switch off during fights, as we've seen. Will that be an issue? Well, of course, time will tell, but it is something that you think Team Yarde are going to be looking at as a flaw within David Benavidez as a fighter, thinking, he does get lazy, he tends to drop his hands, he tends to leave himself open at certain points of the fight. It's whether they can come up with a good enough game plan to exploit that. And Anthony Yarde can punch, and we know he can punch and hurt fighters. So, like you said, he does have that opportunity to land something significant where we see Benavidez in trouble again, and whether he can overcome that adversity. So it does actually pose an interesting set of events, really, if some of these come off. However, being negative on this episode, I think Anthony Yarde's big fight experience, although he's had some big fight experience, I feel like what happens with Anthony Yarde's career is he jumps up to like a massive level from where he is, has a huge fight, shows that he's got a lack of experience, and then gets beaten, then drops back down to more of a domestic level, fighting UK-based fighters or European-based fighters, looks good against those fighters, then jumps back up a level, like he did against Beterbiev, gave a good showing for himself, but then got dropped back down again, and then fought Lyndon Arthur for a third time and beat Lyndon Arthur in his last fight, and now he's jumping back up again in class and level to fight David Benavidez, who obviously hasn't been beaten in his career yet. So if patterns and trends are anything to go by in Anthony Yarde's career, most people will be feeling that this is going to be a very similar affair for Anthony Yarde. That is it going to be third time lucky, or is it just going to follow the pattern and trend of his career, Hamed? Is he just going to jump up and not have that big fight experience because he hasn't had like back-to-back big fights? He like I keep saying, he drops down in level, then jumps back up, and then he seemingly looks like he's out of water when he gets to that top level. Do you think this could be a big factor again, or do you think the third time he goes up again to a big fight with a big fighter, actually he might have an opportunity to right some of those wrongs?
To put it bluntly, I think David Benavidez should be fighting either Artur Beterbiev or Dmitry Bivol. He's at that level or cusp where I would say he's just a notch below. Can he dethrone those guys or beat those guys? Maybe dethrone is not the right word because he's a champion at the moment, technically, and Beterbiev doesn't have a belt. But can he beat those guys or upset those guys? That's the big question I wanted to know, and because of what's happened, unfortunate, with the whole Beterbiev Bivol or Bivol Beterbiev trilogy fight, which ended up not happening. I think it got delayed. Then Bivol ended up getting injured. I think they were trying to, Turki Al-Sheikh was trying to find a Russian promoter. I think he was one of the Kremlin. They were going to put that on because both fighters wanted in Russia. Long story, but then Bivol got injured, and then Beterbiev ended up pulling out. He was meant to fight on the undercard, I think, against Dion Nicholson, and they were going to set up a Beterbiev Benavidez fight for next, I think, February, early next year. So I would have liked to have seen David Benavidez ideally fight those guys. If not, I was content with David Benavidez and Callum Smith fighting, but Callum Smith is gonna, looks like, fight David Morrell. So this is not a bad fight, if I'm being honest. Like, is it the fight I think most boxer fans will wanted? Probably not, but from a British aspect, you have got a very good British light heavyweight who's also fought at the top level and has actually pushed some of these fighters close, like Beterbiev, Kovalev. He ended up badly hurting, but I think Kovalev ended up finding a second win and then coming back. That's where I do believe experience mattered. In the Beterbiev fight, I don't know if experience was the thing. I just think Beterbiev was all round a better fighter because, yeah, did have a lot of things in his advantage. The fight was in the UK, in his hometown, I believe, London. A lot of the officials, I believe the judges, were favoring the Yarde. I think two of them, I believe, had Yarde ahead, which I strongly disagree with. But this fight, to me, the tendency is for Yarde. He ends up in a lot of fights, I think, getting a bit. Um, I don't know if tendency is the right way. I think it's just how he fights. He's very inactive in certain rounds, and then he has a burst where he will throw, but that could be the big factor because let's not forget he did lose a fight to Lyndon Arthur. I believe it was in lockdown, and he was kind of not throwing or very had a very bad work rate in that fight. I know he ended up stopping him in the rematch. Then the third fight, I didn't watch it. I believe most of it. I only catch bits of it. He did end up winning on points, but for me, he hasn't really separated himself in those three fights. And in two of them, those were both like you could say competitive fights. So fights that went the distance. He won one and he lost one. The second one he did stop Arthur, but I don't know how much of that was to do with how good he was that night, or was Arthur just ill prepared. So I would say I would give him a puncher's chance. If he can land a big shot like he hurt Kovalev, and he did, I believe, buzz or caught Beterbiev in one of the rounds. Because I thought a couple of times where he was getting Beterbiev's respect or attention, but I just don't think he had enough all round to defeat him or put him down or knock him out. And Beterbiev ended up just showing his class. But I would say he's got a chance. You'd have to give him a chance because Benavidez can be made to look quite one-dimensional at times. I believe it comes across like he kind of plods forward. He doesn't have great footwork, so I would give Yard more or less a puncher's chance. And I don't think it's a small puncher's chance; it's a big puncher's chance. These are both big guys. These are both essentially guys that I believe are like cruiserweights, you could say, because I believe Yard used to fight the cruiserweight, and Benavidez more or less balloons up. But I would give Yard a puncher's chance, but I would make also Benavidez like a clear favorite in my opinion. But I won't be also surprised either way because I think it's a winnable fight for both fighters.
Well, I think David Benavidez wins the fight. That's my prediction for this fight. I agree with you. I think there's a chance. There is a chance that Anthony Yarde could do something, that he could hurt David Benavidez and we could see an upset. But if, I was putting my life on this fight, I'd be going for David Benavidez. I'd say his experience, his physical attributes, his abilities, I think, are better than Anthony Yarde's. It's going to take a really poor showing from David Benavidez for Anthony Yarde to capitalise on for him to win this fight, in my opinion. David Benavidez is no joke. He hasn't tasted defeat. He's overcome adversity, being knocked down before in the past and coming back and beating the fighters he's been in the ring with. So for all that, I think David Benavidez wins this fight. But Anthony Yarde has a very good chance. It's a good opportunity for him. David Benavidez isn't Artur Beterbiev. David Benavidez is a different fighter, someone that can be hurt, someone that can be visibly hurt and put down. And I think this is probably going to be his last chance, I would say, I mean, it may be not his last chance because we know how fights go these days and how some fighters get more opportunities than others. But I would like to say this is probably his last major opportunity at a world title in the light heavyweight division, because all the other fighters are going to be tied up very shortly. And if he doesn't win this fight, the chances of him getting another big fight for a world title or a version of the world title he's going to be right down the packing order again. But then again, like the heavyweight division, I'm contradicting what I'm saying. One fight could change everything for certain fighters. But I'm going to be solid in the prediction. I'm going to go David Benavidez. I think it will go the distance. I don't know if David Benavidez will stop Anthony Yarde. People might suggest that he might do that late, but I'm going to stick with David Benavidez on points for this particular fight. So that's one of the fights on the card. Have you got any final thoughts on this one before we move on, Hamed?
That's how I see it as well. But I could see him maybe putting Yard down or stopping him late. I could see either one of those scenarios. But if it was like a safe bet, or if I was like to put money on it, I would put money on Benavidez outboxing him. Can Yarde knock him out? I think anything is possible. The problem, like you pointed out earlier on, is with Yarde's career. Although I believe he's been tested more than fighters like Joshua Boazzi, who we just saw recently have a controversial decision win over Zach Parker. He's also kind of went from one extreme to the other. He's either fought Bertubiev at the top level or Kovalev. Then in between, he hasn't really had many fights. I think apart from the Lyndon Arthur fights, you can't really name a lot of his opponents that have been impressive or guys that are really well level. I think he's had like wins over fighters like Dex Spellman, and I think there was another fighter. But if I was to make a prediction, I would also favor Benavidez. Big problem is on paper. If you look at Benavidez's resume, he's always come up best against opponents that were perceived to be a threat. Like you pointed out, he's unbeaten, but he's also done a number on. I know a lot of these guys may be different size or smaller, but Demetrius Andrade, Caleb Plant, Gvozdyk. I would have liked to have seen how Yard would have fared against Gvozdyk, David Morrell. A lot of these fighters he's beaten. I believe if Yard was to fight one or two of these guys, those would be his best victories. And that's, I think, the main difference with this fight. So, to put it briefly, bluntly, I would say Benavidez on points is a safe bet as well.
Okay, well, let's move on then, Hamid, to another fight on the card. Sam Noakes versus Abdullah Mason, WBO World Lightweight title up for grabs. The vacant title is up for grabs. We've got 17-0 Sam Noakes versus 19-0 Abdullah Mason. Me and you were speaking before we started this podcast, and we was talking about, obviously, Sam Noakes is not a fighter you've particularly followed over the years, but you've seen a lot of Abdullah Mason going into this particular fight. So to set the scene, really, for everybody listening, for those that are British that listen to the podcast, or those that are American who listen to the podcast and tune into the Queensborough Promotions shows, Sam Noakes is a fighter who has progressively got better over the years. And as I said to you, Hamid, before, he has probably done everything he needs to do to be up at this level. Like, the difference between, say, him and someone like Anthony Yarde was going down the traditional route, but then was jumping up sort of 2 levels, going to the top level. Sam Noakes has done everything he needs to do, fighting for the British, the Commonwealth, the European version of titles in the lightweight division, and now he's fighting for a vacant world title against a guy who is being touted as a superstar in Abdullah Mason. So he's done everything I think he needs to do to prepare for a fight like this, and he is a good boxer. He's fast, he can hit hard. He's got 15 KOs out of his 17 fights, so, he's someone that isn't to be taken lightly going into it. But on the other side, in the opposite corner, you've got Abdullah Mason, who's 19-0 at 21 years of age, who looks like a sensational fighter already. And I think when I was talking to you before, I was saying how his last 2 fights in particular this year have been the ones that have really made a lot of people look at him and go, actually, yeah, he's not just a padded prospect. Actually, he's beating guys that are former top level opponents or former champions. His last fight against Nakathila, that was the one where he retired him in 5 rounds. And for me, that was a huge win going into this particular fight for a world title. He has to be the favourite, Mason, going into this fight for most people. What do you make of Abdullah Mason first and foremost as a fighter, and where he's at, and obviously his chances of picking up a world title this weekend?
I've been like very fortunate to end up watching a lot of these top rank cards when I had Sky Sports, because they had the deal with Top Rank, and Abdullah Mason would be fighting on a lot of these cards. He's only 21, but I've pretty much seen majority, I believe, of his career, and in most of his fights he's looked very impressive. The fight with the German Nakatilia, I think Carlos Anelius, he's knocked out a lot of these opponents or stopped them in one-sided fashion. I think the only fight where he kind of struggled was, I can't remember the opponent's name, but he ended up getting knocked down a couple of times. It may have been the fight before actually, Anelius. I can't remember if it was that fight or another fight, but he did get dropped a couple of times, and people are saying he's kind of overrated in a way. But I think some people just had to pump the brakes, because at that time I think they were kind of going a bit over the board. but at the same time he's shown he's kind of a class above a lot of the fighters his age. At just 21, he's already like challenging for a title, and I believe he should win this fight, even though I've not seen much of Sam Noakes' career. I think the main difference with a fighter like Sam Noakes and Anthony Yarde is Sam Noakes, I believe, had a amateur background or amateur career, and he's gone down the traditional route where Yarde didn't have, I believe, much amateur experience. I think he only had a handful of amateur fights and kind of was learning on the job, as they say. And he kind of went from kind of having a lot of these low level fights to suddenly jumping up to like a high level at I would say a kind of a quick time, because they fed him so many limited or no hope as opponent type of fights where I don't think Yard was learning anything. So this is a fight I believe you could say Abdullah Mason is a favorite, but is a fight between two very good fighters or two talented fighters as well.
I'm looking forward to it. I think when you get two undefeated fighters, especially when it's UK versus USA, you know, it makes for an even tastier affair. You know, there's always bragging rights involved in events like this as well. And I think this fight between the two of them really will showcase where they are at now. It's for a world title. They've got an opportunity to become world champion. So they're both going to put everything on the line. And I'm looking forward to it. Abdullah Mason, you know, in BoxRec rankings, if that's anything to go by, if anything, you know, sees any believability in them, they got him at 6 and Sam Noakes at number 10. And, you know, it's a good fight. It's two top 10 guys fighting for a vacant title. And we can't really argue with that. They're both undefeated. They're both relatively young fighters. So it really shows what the future of the lightweight division could potentially look like. So I am looking forward to this fight. Again, if I'm going to predict a fight, I'm not a prediction specialist. I don't, you know, go out there saying I am. I'm just going to go off what I've seen of both guys. And from what I've seen of both guys, I would like to favour Abdullah Mason would get the late stoppage in this fight against Sam Noakes. But you can't take away anything from Sam Noakes' power and the ability to maybe take away some of that experience that he's had in his fights against Abdullah Mason. So I think it's going to be an interesting affair, but I'm going to go with Abdullah Mason in this one. Is there any final ones for you? Is there any predictions you want to make for this one?
I've not seen much of Sam Noakes, to be fair, because I don't always get to watch all the undercard fights. But I just want to correct myself. I believe the fighter that Abdullah Mason got dropped by was Johan Vasquez, because I just have to double check on BoxRec, because my memory, he was more or less a journeyman. You could classify him as, I think he had 5 or 6 defeats at the time, and he dropped 5 or 6 defeats now, actually 6 defeats. So he dropped to Abdullah Mason last November, and since that fight, I believe Abdullah Mason has won his last couple of fights. The Nakatilia one being very impressive. At the same time, he did fight some of these opponents who were way past their prime or best. So, like you said, they're both in their prime. I would have to also favor Abdullah Mason, and uh, on paper, this is a fight I believe that Sam Noakes is capable of winning, because he is also, I think, the best opponent that Abdullah Mason is fighting. I know you could argue vice versa, but on paper, I would have to, if I was a betting man, go with Abdullah Mason.
So let's move on to another fight on the card. And one of the big four that's happening on this event, Brian Norman Jr. versus Devin Haney, WBO welterweight crown up for grabs. Two undefeated fighters, two fighters that I would say are coming to the peak of their powers as fighters. And of course, Devin Haney is the one that's probably favoured in this particular fight. But I think this is probably one of the more exciting fights on the card for me, because Brian Norman Jr. has been someone that's been chasing him down for a while. You know, he's kind of been a guy where he's just been dismissed. He's been dismissed as a fighter in this division, not somebody, you know, to sort of look at, not so much by me as a boxing fan or by many other boxing fans, but just sort of the general consensus I've found, you know, in terms of media outlets and social media talking about certain fighters in this welterweight division. I think it's only really been the past 18 months where people have really started to pick up on the fact that Brian Norman Jr. could be a real threat to the welterweight division. I think his last 3 fights in particular have been the ones that, again, have really made people stand up with him and go, do you know what, this guy actually is a very good fighter. He's the WBO World Welterweight Champion. He's had some really big wins over Giovanni Santillan. That was probably, for me, the biggest win of his career so far. And then he's followed that up with 2 victories, one by a TKO and one by a KO in his last 2 fights this year. He's looking fantastic so far, but he's going in there against his biggest challenge yet, which is Devin Haney, who, of course, has been stepping up through the weights. Of course, we've got that infamous fight with Ryan Garcia, which was turned into a no contest where he was technically beaten, and he's technically a beaten fighter in many people's eyes, but has since come back and had that win over Jose Carlos Ramirez earlier this year. So I'm going to hand it over to you, Hamed, and give me your thoughts on this particular fight. Thoughts, of course, on Brian Norman Jr. as a champion going into this and his abilities, but more so about Devin Haney, the guy that's been obviously said as the A side of this fight, the superstar of this fight, but yet the guy that obviously was dropped and hurt against Ryan Garcia, who we know then tested positive for performance-enhancing drugs.
I believe Brian Norman at the moment is the standout welterweight belt holder or champion, if you want to put it. Now that Butch Ennis has moved up and Virgil Ortiz is also not at welterweight. So at that point, you'd have to, by default, say he is the number 1 guy that's got a title, but he's also not really been tested of what the same level of opposition as Devin Haney has. Whether that's a 140 or 135, I think just the fact that Devin Haney has unified titles or been an undisputed champion and won titles in different divisions, there is, I think, a double-edged sword with this fight. It's very hard to know or predict what version of Devin Haney will turn up. Like you said, what happened with the Ryan Garcia fight. Before that, Devin Haney almost looked like a fighter that was very tough or hard to beat or read even in some of these fights. Like, he had a tough fight with Lomachenko. I thought that could have went either way. I know that was controversial or a contentious decision, but then he ended up blanking Regis Prograis 12-0 or 12-zip in his first fight at 140. He also dropped him as well in, I think, the second or third round. And he didn't really come close to losing apart from the Lomachenko fight. And then that thing happened with it, Ryan Garcia, and then the scandal. I've also saw and I don't know if Devin Haney will be the same guy, just to backtrack with what I was saying, because of how he looked in his comeback fight with Jose Ramirez. Some would argue that Prograis and especially Ramirez seen better days. I think Ramirez was shot to pieces or washed up vision, and even then Haney was way too negative. Like, I understand in the first 5-6 rounds you were going to be a bit defensive, but then he was running around and it was very evasive and not willing to stand his ground or exchange. And it was it was an ugly fight to watch and not a great or impressive performance. And I don't know if that will carry on to this fight. I've seen most of Brian Norman's career when he stepped up or was on the scene. I thought he didn't look good against Quinton Randall. That was the first time I saw him. I think he was on a top rank undercard. I believe he was maybe on one of the Thursday night cards they had. I think it was the Shakur Stevenson card where he was fighting on a Thursday night with Edwin De Los Santos, and I don't think he looked that good. And then the fight with Boca Chica, he got dropped, and he didn't look good. I think he was cut in that fight, but then he ended up being a no contest because I think Boca Chica headbutted him. Since then, like you pointed out, the Santillan fight I watched live, which was, I believe, on the undercard of I think it was Emmanuel Navarrete and Dennis Berancek. The same night, I believe, later in the night when Usyk and Fury fought for undisputed. Usyk beat Fury, and then Berancek beat Navarrete. But on the undercard, Norman looked very good against Santillan when he beat him by stoppage. And it was, I think, in the 10th round, and he dominated that fight. And Santillan was unbeaten, who had a very good, impressive win, I believe, over Alexis Rocha when he stopped Rocha. So that was a good win. He stopped Derek Cuevas, not the greatest opponent, on I think a Michaela Mayer undercard, which was like a early knockout, and then he stopped Jin Sasaki. That was a very ugly knockout, and I was thinking if he used to fight fighters like Ryan Garcia, Rolly Romero, even Devin Haney, if he could catch these guys, he should knock them out. My only problem would be with this fight is we've never seen really Norman fight a guy who I do like outside the ring and even in the ring. He's very entertaining. He seems like a very down to earth, up and coming American fighter champion. But I would never seen him fight a guy or a moving target or an elite opponent, elite champion or former champion. So that's where I think Devin Haney, if he wants to make this ugly, it could be ugly to watch. That's where we'll find out if Brian Norman actually has different dimensions. If Brian Norman has to chase him and he could cut off the ring and can catch Haney, then he could knock Haney out and he couldn't make Haney look bad. Tigala Sheikh has said all along he doesn't want Tom and Jerry fights. I don't know if this is that type of fight. Will the judges reward or will they punish Devin Haney? You could argue it's a 50-50 fight, but I would say all the momentum, everything is with Brian Norman. If you're a gambling man, you'd have to favor Brian Norman. I don't know what Devin Haney has got left. Psychologically, he doesn't look the same guy. I believe at welterweight, he's not the same fighter he was at 140, or especially at 135, where he had all the advantages. I could see Haney having an avenue to winning, but I don't know if he could find his way to get to that place, because he's gonna have to either show he could take the same type of punishment, or he's gonna have to fight extremely negative and negate everything Brian Norman has. So it's an interesting fight, and I think it's a bit of a tough fight to predict, but you'd have to slightly favor Brian Norman.
It's a good take. I like that take. I like the fact that you're not just going automatically with Devin Haney because he's the superstar and because obviously he's got a more accomplished resume behind him. The fact that Brian Norman Jr. obviously hasn't had to go through what Devin Haney's gone through with his loss to Ryan Garcia and obviously the mental sort of adverse moment he's had to go through in that particular fight. He was just in some ways just very fortunate that, you know, he tested positive for Osterine, Ryan Garcia, because, you know, right now we'd be looking at a guy who had that one on his resume as well, that one loss, and we don't know how that has actually long-term affected him. And you made a couple of points there that I'll pick up on about, you know, we don't know what Devin Haney's got left, and it sounds quite crazy to sort of contemplate that, really, you know, the fact that really in boxing terms, he's a young fighter at 27. You know, is he in his prime? Has he got to his prime? I mean, there's answers really that we haven't had yet from him. And I think if he was to win this title by beating Brian Norman Jr., I think that would go some way to bringing some credibility back to him after that loss that was overturned. Beating a guy like Brian Norman Jr., who is the champion, who is probably favoured by a lot of boxing fans, including yourself, I think that would go some way to sort of saying, yeah, actually, Devin Haney is as good as what he's always said he is, and he's come back from an adverse moment in his career, and actually, he deserves to be WBO champion. And the but here for this fight is that you've got a guy in the other corner who hasn't faced defeat yet, who hasn't seen that level of adversity, and has had some difficult fights through his career. And really, we'll probably look at some of Devin Haney's fights where he's had moments of, I'd say, contemplation. The Ryan Garcia fight, the Lomachenko fight, I think that's one in particular where people will look at that and go, really? Did Devin Haney win that? A lot of people don't believe he ever did. So you got to look back in his career over the past couple of years and find little moments in Devin Haney's career where you think, actually, if you put him under that much pressure and match him, is he going to fold in the fight? Is he going to back down? Is he going to, you know, take away from center ring and actually be on the back foot and try to box you on the back foot? Brian Norman Jr. is the type of fighter that will take advantage of these, you know, I wouldn't say flaws in Devin Haney. I'd say moments. I'd say there are moments where, questions are going to be asked of him. So when you say Brian Norman Jr. is probably the favoured fighter in this, Hamed, well, I would agree. And I would say, one, he's the champion. One, he's earned his stripes. Two, he's fighting a guy who technically we've seen beaten, maybe more than once, if that Lomachenko fight's anything to go by as well. And actually, I think when you look at this fight, rather than going for the name in Devin Haney, I would say go for the actual talented fighter on the opposite corner that can actually match Devin Haney in Brian Norman Jr. So I think this is a genuine 50-50 fight where we're really going to see what Devin Haney is still working with up at this weight, and if he can overcome some level of adversity in this fight. So I'd probably go with you on this one, Hamed. I'd probably say I'd like to favour Brian Norman Jr. on points in this one, unless Devin Haney comes back and produces a sensational performance and actually proves a lot of people wrong. But I'm going for Brian Norman as well.
I think you could argue either way, but if I was to pick Norman, I think he should stop AD. I know maybe you could drop him multiple times or drop him and put and win the points decision like that. But I think for Haney to win, he's gonna have to make it ugly. And Haney, if it goes to points and is that type of fight, then I think Haney should win. Like, I agree, it's more or less 50-50 because of who Devin Haney has fought. He has actually fought, I think, technically our welterweight, if you count the Ramirez fight, which was a catchweight. But he's Brian Norman has not really fought the same level of opposition, even if that wasn't a welterweight or different weight class. The thing is, I think style wise is more or less a boxer against a puncher. Devin Haney last had a stoppage win in 2019, I think, against Zoya Abdulayev. I was kind of going back and forth with this fight at first, but I always thought it's more or less 50-50. In the last couple of weeks, I've seen a lot of people whose opinions I respect or who, like, make predictions or do this type of calls, and they all leaning towards Norman. And I kind of did a bit more like dived into the fight, and I just looked at it from both aspects. I think you'd have to slightly favor Brian Norman based on recent form, momentum, how both fighters are psychologically looking in the last couple of fights, and you'd have to favor Norman. But it's a fight that could go either way. Devin Haney could definitely win, but he'll have to make it really ugly. And at that point, I don't know, do you even reward him, or will the judges reward him? He has come close, I think, to losing a couple of times. He got clipped by Jorge Linares as well. I think Linares was clearly past his prime, but still had, I think, something left at a lightweight. I think he got knocked out by Kanu, but that was at a higher weight class. And he got clipped by him. He got, I thought, buzzed and had a very close fight to Lomachenko. So there have been fights where even when he's had size advantage, he's come close to losing, or some people thought he lost those fights. In this fight, I think this is a risky and a dangerous fight for Devin Haney, because he's going in against a legitimate welterweight who's a big puncher as well. The only thing I would say, just to wrap it up, Norman, we don't know how good he really is. He looks the part. He so far is fighting or has been winning in the style that looks like he is the guy that was the biggest threat to Boots Ennis before Boots Ennis moved up. I know that fight didn't happen, but he hasn't really fought anyone, which really isn't his fault all that much. But I think the Norman's family or the senior kind of did mess up the Boots fight. They turned down like a very high career high paydays. But I just wanted to get your thoughts on one thing. I seen a video by True Geordie. I don't know if you could classify him as a media member, but he called Devin Haney, in his words, to quote, the biggest coward, boxing's biggest coward, which were very strong words. And just listening to briefly some of his points, so a couple of minutes of his video, I don't know. To me, I thought that was a bit bizarre. Like, Ryan Garcia was the one who cheated. He came in overweight. To call him a coward after just one fight, I don't know. To me, I think that's extreme. I don't think any boxer should be called a coward, but Like, to call Devin Haney a coward, I don't know. What do you think about that? And the fact that someone who's classed as a boxing media member or someone who's working with DAZN is actually putting out these labels.
Uh, honestly, I wouldn't class him as a boxing media member. I wouldn't value any opinions that come from that individual. I don't think all he's doing is looking for sensationalism by making comments like that. You know, it doesn't matter whether that fighter is a fighter you don't like. It doesn't matter whether that fighter is a fighter that isn't the greatest fighter in the world. Any fighter that gets into the ring, and you just pointed this out, Ahmed, anybody that gets into the ring at any level has to have some level of mental fortitude. They have to have bravery. They have to have courage, because you are going in there and essentially putting your life on the line. All it takes is one punch in the wrong place, and we've seen what happens. It can cause fatalities. It doesn't happen often, but it does happen, and it can make life-changing injuries for fighters, which we've seen happen. For someone to come out and say that is just sensationalism. It's not even journalism for me. It's just somebody trying to get views and clicks and comments and dislikes. Basically, any engagement, even if it's negative engagement, that's all it is. That's all it is with people like that. Unfortunately, you know, this is, in this day and age, this is what people are looking for. They're looking for engagement. They're looking for views, because on a lot of the platforms, they pay you money. And as a result of it, if you say something which attracts attention, even if it's only 5 minutes of fame, you are going to get that 5 minutes of fame and probably the money that comes with social media, which is crazy. I know I'm going off on a tangent, but you asked me a question, and that's ultimately my answer, is what do you think about that? And I don't agree with it. I don't think he's a coward at all. Just to be, it's like saying Floyd Mayweather's a coward. That's
Yeah,
what it's like saying.
those are, sorry, those are strong words. I completely disagree with that. Even if you, like, I agree with what you're pretty much saying. Like, even if you believe the business practices or some of their behavior decisions outside the ring may be categorized or have like a character flaw, or show like signs of being a coward outside the ring. Inside the ring, I think to call someone that, I think is very, very bad, and very, I think is very disrespectful. The only thing I would say, the reason you could classify him as a media member, uh, sorry to cut you off, but he is working for DAZN. Like, he has got now onto the DAZN platform. I know other people have as well. That's what I don't know. Do you call someone like that a part of the media, or is he still not really a media member? Because I think then DAZN should kind of look at what they're doing with hiring some of these people.
I don't, not me personally. That is just me speaking as a boxing fan first and foremost. I've been doing this 8 years. I would never sit there and say half of the people that get employed to go on certain platforms these days have actually got the level of experience that some genuine people do have that are still within the industry. It's like basically me saying, do I consider myself to be a member of the media? Not particularly, no. And the reason why is because I have a full-time job outside of this. Do I get some money for this? Do I get paid for some of the work I do? Yeah, I do, but it doesn't mean I'm a full-time professional in what I'm doing. Whereas someone like him, this individual particularly, yeah, he is, because he's getting paid off his YouTube channel. He's getting money for doing that, and now DAZN obviously got him on their platform, and he's saying what he wants to say. Again, it's a completely different conversation, Ahmed, because it's about sensationalism and bringing views and attention to DAZN's channel. They'll obviously have their own code of ethics and the way they like their employees to sort of conduct themselves, and there'll be a fine line between what gets said and what gets aired. And if it brings a load of views to the channel because of him calling somebody a coward, it might bring a retaliation response from Team Haney. You never know. And if it does, DAZN are loving that, and they're rubbing their hands together. And so is he, because he's then getting the views he wants. But that's not even about boxing anymore. That's why I'm saying I wouldn't consider someone like that to be a true member of boxing media, because they are not the people that are going out to the gyms. They are not the people that are taking the time to go and spend with fighters in gyms, watching them train, chatting with them, talking with them. That for me is true and real journalism, is spending that time with those fighters, getting to know them, rather than just having one conversation with them and using some sensationalism headlines to sort of promote their own agenda. That's just my personal feeling on it, and that's why I do my best not to do any type of clickbaity headlines or clickbaity shows, because I'm not looking for that. I just want people to listen to these shows and listen to it for the quality, as opposed to just because I might not have millions of views on my channel doesn't make me any less of an experienced and qualified person to have these conversations. So yeah, I know we're completely going off topic, but it's a question you've asked, and I'm sure you guys listening will probably want to know the answer to it, and that's my answer to it. So, have you got any final thoughts then, maybe on this fight before we go on to the last fight of the card that we're looking at today?
No, is nothing wrong with you kind of elaborating, because I did really want to know what other people thought, because a lot of people kind of piggybacked. To be fair, it wasn't on the DAZN channel. I think it was on his own channel, but at the same time, he is still on that platform. And as people or subscribers or people who pay for DAZN, at the same time, we don't want people like that really to be on there. Like, he could do what he wants on his own platform, but if you are gonna be on there, then I think you need to start, like you said, get actual media members. At the moment, I think the Zone are kind of just getting anyone who's gonna get 'em the most views. Regarding the fight, I think technically it is a 50-50 fight. Technically, on paper, Brian Norman and Devin Haney are both undefeated. Excuse me, because of the Ryan Garcia fight ended up being a no contest. So you could argue either way. It depends what you like, I think, in the fight. Do you prefer the boxer who's the more accomplished fighter, who's won more titles, unified titles, uh, has got a better resume, or do you prefer the fighter who's a bigger puncher, who seems like who's coming into his prime or is in his prime and is got all the momentum? Where Devin Haney, we don't know. If we're being honest, I know he's not that old, but we don't know how much he's really got left in the tank psychologically, if he's the same guy, or is he suffering from the same mental trauma that fighters like just recently, someone who I'm sure we'll be talking about soon, Anthony Joshua, is he suffering from the same mental lapses that AJ had after the Andy Ruiz fight? So it's a fight that could go either way. But if I was to say, based on recent history or recent performances, who's the favorite, I would probably lean towards Brian Norman. But I do hope it's a much better fight than the fight we had with Haney and Ramirez, because God, that was an awful fight to watch.
Yeah, it was an awful sight to watch. Well, final fight on the card then. It's not the final fight on the card, but it's the final fight I'm covering for this show, ladies and gentlemen. There are 4 other fights on this card. I'm not going to go through them because I think the show is about the main fights. This is why I'm covering this card. So the final fight on the card that I'm interested in covering with you, Hamed, is Jesse Rodriguez versus Fernando Daniel Martinez. WBC, WBO, super flyweight titles up for grabs. 22-0 versus 18-0. This has got a good fight written all over it. For those that don't know, Fernando Martinez, he, over the past couple of years, again, quietly in the background has made a name for himself in this division. I think, you look at his last 2 fights with Kazuta Ioka, 2 unanimous decisions, very comprehensive unanimous decisions for me over Ioka. But prior to that, he'd also beaten Herwin Ancaraz as well. Twice he'd beaten Ancaraz in 2022. He's beaten good names. Remember, these divisions, these lower divisions, in terms of the amount of fighters we have in them, it's few and far between in terms of the top level fighters in the flyweight and super flyweight division. So, you find it hard to get like a big depth within these divisions. So you find the same fighters are usually fighting the top 3 or 4 guys, which kind of makes it better in a way. But this fight is a really good fight because you've got Bam Rodriguez, obviously the dominating force at the moment in the division at 22-0, who, has done everything he's needed to do to put himself right up there as a top pound for pound star in the division. He's currently the WBC and WBO champion, and I think going into this fight, he's gonna be the heavy favorite. But I think Martinez, 18-0. has actually got the ability to make this a really, really good fight between the two of them. I think he's got the boxing ability to really negate what Rodriguez brings to the table and make it a really frustrating affair for Rodriguez. And for me, it'll all be about how Rodriguez can cut the ring down and break Martinez down. He has done that, obviously, in 22 previous fights. But can he do that against a guy who I would say is really good at making fights and nullifying them? What do you think about this particular fight then, Hamed?
I think we saved the best to last. If I'm being honest, this is the best fight of the card on paper. I've seen the last two fights of Fernando Puma Martinez live with Kazuta Ioka. The first one was a unification because Martinez won the, I believe, the IBF or Ankahas. I didn't watch both of his fights with Ankahas, but I seen his last two fights. And then he unified after beating Ankahas, and I think I have a couple of other fights on the PBC. Unified with Kazuto Ioka, one of the legendary Japanese fighters, who was, I believe, a three-weight champion who had some very good wins over Kosei Tanaka and some other very good fighters. And they had, I think, a unification last, I believe it was last December, around about, I think it was New Year's Eve. Very good fight. I thought Martinez did enough to win, maybe 7, 8 rounds. You could maybe argue slightly wider, but I don't think it was as wide as the scorecards. They had it like, I think, a shutout on one, and I think 11-1 or something, very wide. But I thought you could argue anywhere from 7 to 9 rounds. I think in retrospect, you could say that. And then they had a rematch. And because of the rematch, I think the IBF stripped him. So this fight with Bam and Primo Martinez should really be an undisputed fight. I think because he contractually was obligated to a rematch, the IBF ended up stripping him. And then in that meantime, Bam has moved up, knocked out a very good fighter who's maybe past his prime, but still serviceable. Kind of was inactive, but he knocked out the great fighter from Mexico. I forgot his name now. My mind is playing up. I think it was. I forgot the name of the fighter, the Mexican fighter. He fought Roman Gonzalez a couple of times. He knocked him out, and then he ended up knocking out Pamela Cafu. So he's unified two of the titles, and he's managed to be like a top 5 pound per pound fighter. And this is a fight a lot of people would probably Estrada. That's the one I forgot. He knocked out Estrada, who had also dropped him. So they traded knockdowns, but that was a very good win. He had already, I believe, beaten Quadras and Sonny Edwards, and he unified titles with Cafu, the South African fighter, who had a very good win, or close win, but a very good fight. He beat a very good fighter, Tanaka, who I mentioned. And this fight, I think, is one of the best fights of the year because they're so small, and because Bam has kind of got such a adulation from his last couple of performances. He's perceived to be a big favorite, but this is a fight I believe is also more or less a 50-50 fight. But on paper, you'd probably have to favor Bam. I think it's a fight that could go either way. I'm not sure who's going to really win this fight because I saw Martinez did get saw him in a tougher fight in the rematch with Ayuka where he did get dropped late on, but I still thought he pulled it through and won by a point. Like I think I had that fight 7-5, but I've been more impressed with some of his wins or the way he's won with some of those fighters and some of Bam's opponents or wins. But you'd have to say Bam's performances have been very impressive. Like the fact that he beat Quadras on late notice, what he did to Sonny Edwards, what he did to some of these other fighters, like even if they were past their prime, he has managed to go up, I think, 2 or 3 divisions and unified titles, won a lot of these titles at like a relatively young age. So if I was to be honest, this is the best fight of the card. They're both undefeated fighters. They're both, I believe, Bam is clearly, I think, a top 5 to 10 pound for pound fighter, and I would put Martinez like a top 10 to 15. I think you could put him anywhere there. Like I've been very impressed with Martinez. So this is the best, in my opinion, the best fight of the card, and it's probably the hardest fight I would say to pick if I'm being honest as well.
Yeah, it's a good assessment of this fight for those obviously that don't really know a lot about Martinez. Most people probably know a lot about Rodriguez going into this fight, but it's a good way of being able to understand what we're looking forward to here at the weekend. It is a fight on the card that I think is a genuine I don't know. For me, it's a genuine I don't know who's going to win this one. Part of me feels that Rodriguez obviously has showcased himself at the top level, and maybe because he's had more mainstream attention over the last few years, maybe I'm kind of swayed into going for him in this particular fight. But I have seen what Martinez has done, and he's got a great resume behind him. Whilst he doesn't have as many stoppages on his resume, that doesn't necessarily mean he can't go in there and outbox and like I said earlier, frustrate Rodriguez in this fight. And that's what makes it exciting. You have kind of got a boxer and a puncher going at it here. And I think Martinez is a sublime boxer. And as we've seen in his fights over the years, I think that's really going to pay dividends in this fight. But it really will be about what Rodriguez brings to the table and whether he can find more than one way of getting to Martinez. It is an exciting fight. For me, it is the fight of the card. I understand that he probably isn't the headliner and Benavidez Yarde is the headliner here, but I think this is the one that most people are going to be tuning in for because it's the one that's probably going to bring the most excitement, I think, going in the ring. So I'm looking forward to this one just as much as you, Hamed. Overall, I think it really sort of, them 4 fights alone that we've covered in this show are very worthy of a pay-per-view. And we talk about pay-per-view stuff a lot when you come on the show, Hamed. And I know you asked me my opinions on pay-per-views, and I was talking about pay-per-views on the last show, the Conor Benn and Chris Eubank Jr. recap that I did earlier in the week. Do I think this show is a pay-per-view worthy show? Yeah, I do think it is. I think, when we talk about quality over quantity, I think this certainly gives you 4 quality fights, and you could just do these 4 fights on the card and pay for these on pay-per-view, and actually I'd be happy just paying for these 4 fights alone. The remainder of the card, you have got one other fight on there that might be of interest to people in the middleweight division. Vitor Mielnicki Jr. versus Samuel Nomura. 21-1 versus 21-0. That's a pretty good fight on the card. But then the rest is literally made up of prospect versus journeyman or prospect versus novice. So it's pretty standard. But these 4 fights alone are definitely worthy of the pay-per-view tag. And it's not often, to be honest, that I do say that. I'm quite critical when it comes down to pay-per-view pricing. But this is one where I'd say people probably will get value for money when they pay for it.
If you were saying is a pay-per-view worthy card, which I heard at the beginning, and then I don't know, you just for a world light heavyweight title, a legitimate title, and you got a 4-fight card. I would say is the second best card, or arguably just as good as the other card. Maybe you could say the other card was better in February with Artur Beterbiev and Dmitry Bivol, with that was like a stacked 7 or 8 fight card. I think they overdone that. They had too many fights on there. I'm not complaining about that, but at the same time, then he leaves the schedule in the other months where you don't have fighters fighting for months and months, and then he just leaves a big hole. And you don't really need that many fights. A 4-fight card is fine. If you want to put a couple more fights on there, that's perfectly fine. I believe the fight with Martinez and Bam is a fight that could have headlined the regular DAZN show, and that would have been a very very high like a high stakes fight where a lot of people are looking forward to it, like an interesting, intriguing fight. So that's a fight that could have headlined in his own card. Benavidez Yard, the same could be said about that, and same with Devin Haney or Brian Norman, and the fight with Abdullah Mason and Sam Noakes, that could have easily been a regular top ranked show. Altogether, I think it is worthy. If I was to pay for a card, like I've been very critical of DAZN, I would pay for it, even though now I'm paid for DAZN because they include in the pay-per-views part of the monthly subscription. But compared it to last week, I probably would not have paid for last week's card if I was like just looking to pay for a card. If I don't have DAZN, if I want to get a pay-per-view, I would pay for this. And just to touch back on there, you got like 2 very good, intriguing 50-50 fights, you could say, with Bam and Puma Martinez, and you could argue Haley and Norman, but you also got like two other good fights on there as well. The main event is still an intriguing or interesting fight because of how both guys fight and their styles and how big they are, and the fact that they can, pretty much punch and knock out a lot of their opponents who they've fought in the past, or they have knocked them out. So is not a bad value for, even if you think a lot of these fights shouldn't be on pay-per-view because we already pay for the zone. But if you want to pay for something, this is, I think, the card to pay for, and I think it's probably the last big card you could say of the year. There's not really much coming up after this. I don't think there's I think there is actually one more card, the PBC card in December, but that's I think the only other card then you could argue. But apart from that, there's really not much anything else going on until I think next year. But yeah, I'm looking forward to the whole card, and I think at least three of these fights should deliver. Hopefully, they all can deliver. That'd be very good as well for the public.
Oh, he would, absolutely. I agree. It's probably the last big card of the year and the last major sort of, significant fight card of the year. I think we have got a couple of cards left over, but nothing majorly significant. We are actually going to get together and do another show regarding the announcement of Anthony Joshua stepping in to face Jake Paul in December in an 8-round professional bout, which, we can certainly have a different show. It'd take up too long of a show to do that in one show, which is why we've not covered it here. But we're certainly going to get together and do that separately and have that conversation around that. But there's nothing else significant. This is the card to be tuning into this weekend. This is the one. I think once we get past this point, we're going to start to look at what's coming in the new year. Major shows in the new year. There still might be sort of things yet to announce as such that we're waiting for in the background. But as far as I'm concerned, in terms of what you're paying for this year, this is probably the high, apart from the February show that you mentioned earlier, Ahmed, this is the highest quality show we've got going this year. So I'm looking forward to it. And again, as always, I appreciate the fact that you've come on the show and give your opinions on it, and you've given some great takes on it. And I hope you guys listening have appreciated, obviously, having Hamed on and his opinions on this show. And if you have, please do let us know. We always say drop the comments in Spotify. You have been doing the last few weeks. I've been seeing some great comments, some great opinions come through. Please continue to do that. It's really appreciated. That is pretty much everything for this particular show, ladies and gentlemen. A little bit longer than normal, but this is what happens when you get somebody on with a completely different take on what's going on over the weekend. So thank you, as always, for coming on the show, Hamed, and thank you to everybody else for listening. Ahmed, any final words before we close this off?
Yeah, thanks for having me on. I'm really looking forward to this card. I think the last main event or card that I thought I was looking forward to and I thought that would deliver was probably, you'd have to go back to Crawford Canelo, which was free on Netflix, but that was back in September. We ended up getting a very good fight with Fabio Wardley and Joseph Parker, which ended up delivering. And now we found out Joseph Parker's being busted for cocaine, but that's the story for another day. But I thought the fight last week didn't deliver, if I'm being honest. The card ended up not being too bad, that people like yourself or others who have watched the whole card, but the main event I don't think delivered. This card I am looking forward to. I just want to add one more thing. Chris Eubank Jr.'s brother, I believe, Harlem Eubank, is fighting on the Friday. So if anyone's interested, I believe that's on Channel 5, but there's really not much other boxing on. I think the only boxing that's at the moment coming on is only on the Zone. In the UK, there's not much boxing on the other platforms, but hopefully after this card and then next month, hopefully, the new year, we can start picking up and we could get more regular shows, which I think will be coming thick and fast. But it'll be good to chop it up with you, hopefully, again, some other day.
Thanks as always, Hamed, and thank you to everybody listening. Thank you to those who subscribe through Patreon as well. Really appreciate your support there, and those on social media. I continue to engage with all of the historical posts, the quotes from different fighters over the years. I really appreciate all the engagement via those social channels as well. But that is it for this episode. Thank you so much for listening. We hope you enjoy the fights, and we'll be back next week with more reaction and aftermath to what's happening this weekend. Thank you.